This trio sonata by Arcangelo Corelli begins with a very nice example of musical imitation. The first violin presents a melodic theme, outlined in the blue box. This voice is called the leader. The second violin then retraces the same melodic material, but exactly one measure later. This voice is called the follower. In the third measure, the basso continuo part also begins to follow in imitation, but only for the first few notes of the theme. Then it gets back to the job of supplying the bass for the chord progressions. Notice that the first follower follows the leader at the interval of a unison, while the second follower imitates one octave lower. It is always important to be aware of the exact interval of imitation, as well as the time delay between entries. In this case, the first follower begins after a one-measure delay, while the second follower begins after a two-measure delay. This kind of imitative counterpoint is closely related to canon, and the two terms exist on a continuous spectrum. Canon is simply the strictest kind of imitation, where the following voice can be defined by a precise rule. For instance, if Corelli had continued the imitation of the second violin through the entire composition, consistently obeying the rule that it must follow the leader at the interval of a unison at a one-measure delay, we could call its relationship to the leader a canon. In fact, the word canon originally referred to the rule that defines the imitation. In the actual piece, however, Corelli breaks off the imitation after the first few measures, so this example would be more accurately referred to as imitation than canon. Here is a different example of imitation from the Recordare of Mozart's Requiem. In this example, the alto soloist leads, and the bass soloist follows at the lower seventh, with a time delay of one measure. Any interval can be used as an interval of imitation, and in this case, the interval of imitation is dissonant. Mozart allows the two voices to clash beautifully as correctly prepared and resolved suspensions. As the voices approach the half cadence at the end of the phrase, the imitation dissolves, and the voices gradually come together in consonance. Even the syllables of the text, which at the beginning of the phrase were metrically separated from one another, now smoothly come together for the final word pa. For the final example, I'll let you figure out where the imitation lies. There are two very short imitative passages in this example. Pause the video if you need to identify what the intervals of imitation are and the time delay between entries. Brahms and Robert Schumann both loved to include short imitative and canonic passages in their piano music such as this, and oftentimes they are so well hidden that they pass by without the listener or performer noticing. In this case, the first leader is this melodic motive in measure 4, which is imitated in the bass line at the lower seventh. Strictly speaking, the imitation takes place at the lower 14th. But there is no need to distinguish between compound and simple intervals. We just say seventh. The time delay is very short, only 1/8 note. The second passage is here, where the same motive is imitated in the outer voices at the lower 5th, also with a time delay of only 1/8 note. Although Imitation and Canon are easy to understand, they are not so easy to compose. My biggest piece of advice is that the secret to strong imitative counterpoint is to have already mastered non-imitative counterpoint. If you have not gone through the videos and exercises in the playlist titled Tonal Voice Leading, I highly recommend that you go back and do so, at least through the video on the Tchaikovsky exercises, before continuing. Let's move on to a tutorial on how to compose imitative counterpoint against a Cantus firmus. Here's an example of such an exercise written by François-Joseph Fetis. The blue alto voice, for the most part, follows the red soprano voice at the lower fourth. But as we will see, Fetis takes a number of liberties with the imitation. I will warn you in advance that this is just about the most difficult kind of counterpoint exercise that I know of. Early on, we used the Cantus firmus like training wheels on a bike to make things easier for the student. But here, the given melody complicates things quite a bit, as we'll see in a moment. This might seem like a needlessly difficult exercise, but it is worth pointing out that it does have a counterpart in real music. For instance, in every third variation of the Goldberg variations, Bach reused the same fixed bass line and composed canonic upper voices at various intervals of imitation. If you can compose imitation or canon under these strict circumstances, then composing free canons will seem comparatively easy. Let's listen to Fetis' exercise. Before we compose our own, we should investigate the liberties and deviations from strict canon that Fetis used to make his exercise a little bit more manageable. The exercise begins with a time delay of 2 measures. However, Fetis sneakily manages to lengthen the time delay by the time we get to measure 6. Notice that back in measure 4, the soprano had only 1 quarter note rest, but in measure 6, the alto rests for 3 beats. Then in measure 9, the alto plays a whole note B that was simply not there in the soprano 2.5 measures earlier. After a rest, the time delay is shortened to only 1 measure. That means that none of this stuff in measures 6, 7, and 8 in the leading voice was ever taken up by the follower. Fetis also uses the opportunity of this quarter note rest at the beginning of measure 10 to adjust the interval of imitation, so that the alto note G follows a 5th below the soprano note D rather than a 4th. Fetis adjusts the interval of imitation again a little bit later, when the soprano note F on beat 3 of measure 11 is imitated by the note A in the alto voice in measure 12, a 6th below the leading voice. Then in measures 13 and 14, the interval of imitation returns to a 5th, and the time delay is shortened to even less than 1 measure as we approach the cadence. All of this might make it seem as if I am judging Fetis for his inconsistency. But this is actually a very good example of all of the tiny tricks that a composer can use to give the impression of imitation continuing beyond when it is compositionally feasible. Remember that this kind of exercise is really hard, and these tiny adjustments are only going to be considered poor if they are clearly audible. It is much easier to notice these things with our eyes looking over the notated score than to notice that anything weird is going on while listening in real time. For the tutorial, I'm going to compose a canon at the upper fifth with a 2-measure delay. The counterpoint is going to be free rather than strict. That means that we can use all of the unprepared essential 7th chords and secondary chromaticism that we learned about in the video on the counterpoint of dominant 7th chords. Just like Fetis, we also have the option of using rests when we get into a pinch, as well as breaking or adjusting the interval of imitation or the time delay of the imitation. Preferably, though, the ideal we are aiming for would be perfectly strict Fuchs-style counterpoint following a strict canonic rule consistently. Let's start at the end. I would like to end with this nice cadence formula, which features a 7/6 suspension in the soprano's follower voice. So I write it in, and then work backwards to check whether or not I can prepare that soprano line in the leading alto voice. If we transpose the soprano line down a fifth and put it 2 measures earlier, we get this. The F in measure 11 works perfectly, but things fall apart after that. The F is tied over as a consonant suspension into measure 12, but then moves by step to a dissonant 7th before returning to F on the downbeat of measure 13. The 7th, therefore, could have been justified as a dissonant neighbor note, but the F in measure 13 is a dissonant 9th above the Cantus firmus, which makes it unusable in this way. We're going to have to make some sort of adjustments. Now, I don't need to worry about whether the alto in measure 13 is correctly imitated by the soprano in measure 15. That is because it is normal and expected, even in a strict canon, that the imitation will break off in order for the voices to cadence at the end of a phrase or an entire composition. Instead of rewriting the whole thing, I was able to make these small adjustments so that I could have my preferred cadence type. We can elaborate the 7/6 suspension in the soprano voice in measure 14 with the embellishing tone A on beat 2. This corresponds to the note D in the alto's leading voice on beat 2 of measure 12. Now the dissonant 7th on beat 3 of that measure is justified as a dissonant passing tone. This is one of the most important concepts in composing canons, what I will refer to as a change of voice leading function. The note E in measure 12 plays a voice leading role as a passing dissonance, but the follower's corresponding note B in measure 14 does not need to have the same kind of function within the context of that measure. In this case, the B is a consonant resolution of a suspension. Let's listen to what we have in measures 11 through 15. Now let's try to compose a beginning for our exercise, keeping in mind that we want the blue alto voice to lead, and for the red soprano voice to follow a fifth higher 2 measures later. That means we have to find a note that will work for the alto above the Cantus firmus note C in measure 1, while the note a fifth higher will work above the Cantus firmus note E in measure 3. Pause the video if you want to try to figure out your own solution. I came up with this. The alto note C forms an octave above the bass, and the soprano note G forms a 10th above its bass note E. I also noticed that in measure 3, the alto could have moved down a 4th to G, and that this would allow the soprano to move down a 4th to the consonant note D in measure 5. Anytime you can plan out these kinds of mid to long range goal-directed motions, they're usually a good idea. With those notes as a framework, we can see that it is possible to simply move through the descending 4th in conjunct stepwise motion. Notice again the change of function that takes place in the imitation. the dissonant 7/6 suspension in the alto voice of measure 2 becomes a consonant suspension of a fifth that moves through an accented passing tone on beat 3 in measure 4. Let's listen to this opening. Now comes the tricky part. I'm going to fill in the middle by working backwards and forwards from the parts that we already have. We have to walk a very narrow path. The notes that we choose for the follower voice in measures 11 and 12 must work given the constraints of the Cantus firmus and the alto that we've already composed in those measures. But those same notes must also work when transposed down a fifth into the alto voice given the constraints of the Cantus firmus in those measures. I like to think first in terms of first species consonant whole notes, and then I'll worry about adding more rhythmic interest later. Pause the video and try for yourself to come up with plausible alto and soprano notes for those measures. I came up with this. I very much wanted the note A for the soprano in measure 11, because I wanted to form a complete D minor triad. As always, we should try to make our three-voice counterpoint as harmonically complete as possible. That A requires the note D in the alto in measure 9, which luckily forms a perfect fifth above the Cantus firmus. Both voices can then leap up a perfect fourth to their respective notes in measures 10 and 12, and join up with the notes that we've already composed by recovering those leaps down by step in the opposite direction. I decided I would rhythmically elaborate this leap of a fourth by filling it in with eighth note stepwise motion on beat 4. This activity on beat 4 leaves a lot of space for the other voice to move on the other beats of the measure, and we do want to keep the voices moving. Remember that a smooth, composite rhythm is very important to sustain the impression of independent voices and successful polyphony. I noticed that I could elaborate the empty part of measure 11 with a 4/3 suspension in the alto voice, which would then require me to change measure 13 as well to create a 7/6 suspension in the soprano. Let's listen from measure 9 to the end of the piece. Now let's go back to the beginning and get some practice composing forward. We need to find notes for the alto voice that will fit given the Cantus firmus of measures 4 and 5, and the already composed soprano line. These notes will also need to fit transposed up a fifth over the Cantus firmus of measures 6 and 7. In measure 4, I definitely want the note E, since we already have the notes C and G, and the note E would form a complete C major triad. This would require the note B for the soprano in measure 6, and at first this seems not to work, since B would form a dissonant tritone above the bass note F. However, if we are creative enough, we can find a way to make it work. That tritone belongs to the dominant 7th chord in the key of C. And remember that we are composing free rather than strict counterpoint. So this measure could be harmonized as a G dominant 7th, with the chordal 7th in the bass, which correctly resolves down by step in the next measure, and the leading tone, scale degree 7, in the soprano. That leading tone will need to resolve upward by step to C in measure 7, forming a 6th above the bass. And this will require the alto voice to take the note F in measure 5, which, luckily, is the chordal 7th of the dominant. So in order to make this work, measures 5 and 6 need to prolong the dominant 7th harmony, moving from root position in measure 5 to third inversion, or 4-2 position, in measure 6. Now I just need to elaborate that chord progression with some faster note values. Notice that in measure 5, the G chord is missing its leading tone. So I would like to find a way to move the soprano voice through the note B. We would also really like to have the note G at some point in measure 6 to guarantee the sound of the root of that chord. I came up with this. Let's listen to the first 7 measures of the canon. Now let's try to join things up in the middle by composing an alto for measures 7 and 8 and a soprano for measures 9 and 10. My first thought was that it would be nice to use the note C in the alto of measure 8, so that the perfect fifth on the downbeat of measure 9 could be approached in contrary motion. However, this would require the note G in the soprano in measure 10, which, in addition to producing an incomplete triad with a missing chordal third in that measure, also produces parallel fifths with the Cantus firmus moving into measure 11. Since we can't do that, we're going to have to approach the fifth in measure 9 from above, so that the other fifth in measure 11 can be approached in contrary motion, for instance like this. This creates direct fifths, also sometimes known as hidden fifths. But I don't think there was any better solution. And, as we've mentioned in previous videos, approaching perfect intervals by similar motion becomes, to some extent, inevitable in three-voiced writing anyway. Measure 10 now has an incomplete C major triad, so I would like the soprano to reach out to the note E at some point in the measure, like this. These quarter notes don't create any problems for the alto in measure 8, so we can move on. Pause the video again, and try to find an alto note for measure 7 and a soprano note for measure 9. Both measures 7 and 9, so far, have incomplete triads, but the one in measure 9 is the more urgent of the two to fix. We already have the chordal root and fifth of a G major triad in measure 9, whereas in measure 7, we have the root and third of a first inversion C major chord. First inversion triads with a doubled root or third sound much more natural than a root position triad with a missing third. The missing third sounds very empty, so I came up with this solution. The note B in the soprano of measure 9 and E in the alto of measure 7. I still wanted to include a complete triad in measure 7, and there is still plenty of room in the measure for the alto voice to fill in with quarter notes. In measure 9, there's a little bit less room for the corresponding soprano, since we've already composed those alto eighth notes during the last quarter note. So, if we can move on beats 1, 2, and 3, that would be ideal. I came up with this. Now there is only one measure remaining. If we can't compose a note that works here, we'll have to go back and start making a lot of edits. That is why we work in pencil. Pause the video one last time and see if you can find notes that work for the alto in measure 6 and the soprano in measure 8. I came up with this. The note D in the alto in measure 6 forms the chordal fifth of the G dominant 7th chord we mentioned earlier, and the A in the soprano in measure 8 forms a consonant octave above the bass and third above the downbeat F in the alto. This is not perfect. It would have been nice to include a complete triad in measure 8, and I would have also liked to have articulated the note G in the alto on the downbeat of measure 6, so that the G dominant 7th chord is completely clear. But those solutions do not work, for reasons that I will leave to you to figure out. We are going to have to make compromises like this whenever the two sides of the railroad meet up. Honestly, I'm just happy it works at all. Finally, I'm going to add one more passing tone B to the soprano on the last beat of measure 7, in order to complete the composite rhythm of flowing quarter notes for that measure, making sure, of course, that it also produces correct voice leading for the alto note E on the last quarter of measure 5. With all that work complete, let's listen to the finished canon. This tutorial gives a slightly false impression of how difficult imitative exercises are when written on a Cantus firmus. I composed several different exercises at different intervals of imitation and time delays before choosing the best one to show you, and each one took several hours. Good luck, and I'll see you in the next video where I'll be discussing how to compose a perpetual canon. Bye for now.